In this video, we will talk about input validation, and we will talk about more about variable scope. The first thing, let's talk about input validation. We need to validate user input. So far, we didn't talk about that. So when we ask you to get the user input, we know we use the cin, then save the value from the user input into the variable. We talk about the get line to get the one whole line from the user. But sometimes, remember, when we ask the user to enter a value, if we ask the user to enter an integer value, but they give us double number, or accidentally they enter some other like the string or character, actually that will cause our program fail. So that's why sometimes we need to do the input validation. So this input validation is we will expect the input data from the user to decide whether it be acceptable or not. Then we can continue to pursue what we want to work on the value. Because sometimes the bad input will cause the program crash, and incorrect calculation, the bad output, will be produced from a bad input. Something like earlier we showed you the example. We ask the user to give us the radius for a circle. But if user enter -5, then actually circle area will be pi r squared. -5 squared still 25. So that's why even the user give a radius -5. If we didn't check the user input, then you still tell them, oh, the area is 25 pi. That is a wrong output. So that's why the input validation is important. So from now on, all the code I ask you to implement, no matter lab exercise and homework assignment, you need to start thinking about, after we get the user input, how should we validate the data? So that's why you can see sometimes we can do the input validation according to the range. Yeah, for example, you see earlier we say radius should be greater or equal to 1. That's one kind of the range. Or reasonableness. The same thing, like we say the length and the width for the rectangle. Okay, but then you give me the negative number. That's definitely not reasonable. And also this week, at the end, on Wednesday, we will start making the menu choice on the console. So we ask the user, you have 5 choice, 1 to 5, you can choose. But if user enters 6, we should tell them that's invalid menu choice. So then the other thing is about the mathematics calculation. Supposedly we shouldn't divide 0. But sometimes if you get the value is 0, then you should, actually they will cause the math calculation incorrect because no value can be divided by 0. So before we do that, it's better we validate our data to make sure if this number will be divided by other number, we need to make sure this number is not equal to 0. So the next example, we will modify from example 6. So before we move forward to example 12, modify example 6, let's remind you what example 6 was. So here's example 6. If you remember, we talked about if-else-if statement. So we have your grade for the test score. We ask the user to enter the numeric test score. So I will show you a letter grade. So then we have constant number, A score, B score, C score, D score for the 90, 80, 70, 60. So that's why we can using the if-else-if statement to tell the user their grade. But you see here, before, we never really do the input validation. So we just assume the user will give us the value between 0 to 100. But sometimes, maybe not, right? Okay, so for example, you see we can run this program to see what happened. So you see here, if we enter 76, that's okay because I'm between 0 to 100. So that's why they give us C. However, if we run again, So if we give them accidentally, we give them the negative number. Okay, so they just give us F. So actually, do we really have -6? We don't have, right? So the same thing, for example, if you give the grade, but then you give them 1000, but do we have 1000? So maybe that's just the error input, but we still give them the A. So that's why here is we didn't really check the user input. And also sometimes if the user input, they accidentally give us a letter number, maybe they just give them the wrong, they accidentally give us the username. So then you see you enter the grades F. You didn't tell them, okay, something is wrong. So that's why here we will show you the example in 12, example 9. So this example 9, we will modify from the example 6. We still have our constant number, A score, B score, C score, D score. But then we make a minima score and the maxima score. Because suppose the instructor won't give you the score more than 100. They won't give you the score less than 0. So that's why when we still get user input for the test score, so then we read from the test score. But then here you see before we still have the if, else if statement. But before we start checking the if else statement for the letter grade, we also add another if statement. So this if statement is we validate the input. So if the input is not within the minima and the maxima range, you see here, for example, right, so we know supposedly the grade should be between 0 to 100. However, be careful. Even you are between 0 to 100, but when we really write in the condition, we don't write this way. So this way is wrong. You shouldn't write like this. So instead, we should see here, grade is greater equal to 0. So that's why you see we have the test score grade. Test score greater equal to minimum score. So then you have second part, right? So then the test score less than equal to the maximum score. Then we connect with the AND operator. So that's we talk about your AND or OR operator. We can connect the two conditions. So in C++, we don't allow this way. So then that's why you need to use the AND operator to have the first part and the second part. And they need to meet at the same time. So that's we do the AND. So then after they are in the correct range, so then we do the if-else statement. Otherwise, you see here, we should tell the user, if the input value is not correct, we should give the user error message. So this is an invalid score. Run the program again and enter the value between the range. So that's why you see here, that's our output if we give them the wrong value. So they tell us it's an invalid input. So then you need to have the range between 0 to 100. So the same thing, that's make sure you will run on your IDE to test different input value. You can see right here, we run the example 9 on the Cloud9. So we still have the constant number A to D. Then we add the minimum number. Okay, so we still have the user enter the input. But one thing is we add the original if-else statement become the inner block. So outside we have another condition to check the user input. So if the user input is invalid, so we will give them the error message. So you can see we run the program. Okay, so you can see here when you run the program, okay, so we give you you still have your condition. You run this program, you still have your condition if-else statement, if-else if statement. So that's why if you are still between the correct range, so then you will have correct your grade output. But one thing, if we run again, so you can see here when you run again, after you run again, so let's try a little different. because one thing is now we have the input validation. So since we have the input validation, so now you see here, that's give them an incorrect range. So then we give them 105. So that's why, because you are greater than your maximum range, so that's not valid input. So that's why we give them, this is the invalid score. I'll run the program again. So then you enter a value. So then here we can see, like earlier I showed you the example. Supposedly on different IDE, you see I asked for the test score, right? But accidentally we give them if accidentally we give them a string instead of the number, some IDE, usually the IDE like Visual Studio or Xcode, they will see this data type already incorrect. They will crash the program. But here when we run on Cloud9, you see they just give you the F. So sometimes when how the IDE take care invalid data type, they will have different reaction. So then here you can see in Cloud9 they didn't really fail your program. But I want you to try on your Visual Studio or your code block or Xcode. So then you will see actually your program will crash. So that's about the data type conversion we will talk about in the future class. So we have a couple minutes left in this video. So I want to talk about one thing, the keyword we call scope. So it's not a keyword, it's a concept about the scope in a variable. So we know in the programming, we need to save some information. We need to define a scope, a variable. But this variable, what is the scope? So the scope of a variable is the block in which it is defined, from that point of definition to the end of block. So we need to be careful. Before we only told you to define a variable, but how much or what the life the variable can live, that's the scope we talk about. That's mean sometimes you define a variable, but depends on where you define that variable. That variable only can be live, or we say the scope. So scope kind of is the variable can be accessed. So what is their range they can be accessed? Actually, they are only in the block. So what does block mean? Block mean actually is the braces we leave, right? Remember, you see in your main function, you have braces. We say after your if statement, if you have a code block, you have braces. So any variable, they only live in the block they define. So usually you define a variable inside the block. For example, you have your if-else statement block, or you have your int main function block. So then usually the variable live scope is only in the block. So that's the variable defined. When they inside the block, we can consider they have a local or block scope. When inside a block within another block, can define variable with the same name in as the outer block. When in inner block, outer definition is not available. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, so what means the inner block and the outer block? Okay, so let me give you the example. We see the next one in the 16. So this one actually the inner block is we say here, you see if statement. Then in this if statement, I have the braces. I define an int number. So that's what we call the inner block. But here you see outer block is my main function. I also define a number here. Actually, they have two different number variables, but they are in different code block. This number live in here. This number live in the main. So I don't have enough time, so I need to have another video to talk about this example.